In this video, we will be creating a ground plane that fades off gently into the background. We'll also be using our scratch and roughness mask nodes to put together a simple material. But before we do any of that, let's just rewind our timeline to frame 1 and jump out of our camera with just middle clicking to orbit around. And if you have similar settings to me, when you zoom out, you may lose your geometry, and this is a clipping depth issue. So to solve that, we can just jump into our view options by hitting N on the keyboard, jumping over to view and increasing our endpoint to something like 50 meters to give ourselves a bit of leeway here, and N again to close that panel. And now with our cursor in the world center, again, you can check this with Shift S, cursor to world origin, we're going to add a ground plane. So Shift A, mesh, plane. And we want to adjust the size. You can do so with a little toggle here. Size 20 meters. That should be enough to give it the feeling of rolling off into the distance. Then now we can jump back into our camera view with 0 on the number pad and switch on our material preview. I'm also going to jump into our render options and increase our viewport samples up to 8 and drag out a new window and change it to shader editor. Okay, and with our ground plane selected, we can jump over to our material options and just click new and name it ground. And while we're at it, let's also hit F2 in the viewport and name our object ground. Now we can hide our side panel here with N and just zoom in and start building up our material. Okay, we want to keep this white, but we want to break up some of the overly perfect uniformity. So to do so, let's bring in our good friend, the scratch mask. So Shift and A, go down to group and just select scratch mask. And if we plug that directly into our base color, we don't see much. And that's because we need to make sure our width has, well, some width. Let's give it 0.05. That looks pretty good to me. But we want to have it so it feels like it's a white sort of plastic surface that has little dings and marks on it. So let's introduce a color ramp, plug that in between these two nodes. And with a little drop down here, we can flip color ramp. Now we have, might need to zoom in a bit, little dings and marks here and there. And we can accentuate that effect by just dragging the black part of our ramp closer to the white part. Okay, that looks pretty good to me. The only other thing I'm going to do is just decrease the white here so it isn't perfect white. Something like that looks good. And to break up some of the glossiness, let's just introduce a roughness mask. So again, Shift and A, group, roughness mask. Let's look through this first with Control, Shift, and left click. I think we can scale this up even more and increase the minimum value so we have slightly shinier areas. Again, the darker areas are shiny and the white areas are more matte or more rough. Let's plug that into our roughness input and look through our principal PSDF. Okay, again, you can see just little bits of broken up detail here as it picks up reflections of the environment and our bot. The final thing we're going to do is just introduce a bump node and plug our scratch mask into the distance. Then invert the bump effect and plug our normal into our normal. We're inverting this effect here because our scratch mask has the scratches as white. And this would mean they are elevated, but we want them to be depressed in. So we're going to invert that. Look through our principal BSDF and just turn the strength down, as normally it is way too high. Okay, looking good. Now to tackle the fall off so it gently fades off into the distance. So for this, we need to introduce a gradient node. So Shift and A again. I'm just going to hit search and start typing gradient. We have our gradient texture. Let's just hook it up with Control, Shift, and left click. And you can see what it's doing. Let's just jump out of the camera here. It's just a gradient horizontally across our image plane. But we want our gradient as a radial effect out from the center to the edge. So to do that, let's just switch our gradient type to spherical. Hook up some texture coordinates by selecting our gradient texture and hitting Control and T. And selecting our texture coordinate to be object. So plug that into the vector, and that's looking good, but a little bit too small. So let's just adjust our scale here. We have to decrease it to expand the texture. So let's just click and select all of them, dragging down, and decrease the scale. You can hold shift as well to make the whole process much more precise. That looks good. Now it fades off in a linear fashion, so let's introduce a gradient ramp so we can control that a little bit better. Plug that in here. So we want it to be a full alpha here and fade off gently into transparency. Okay, let's plug that into the alpha of our BSDF and look through it. You can see we have a very harsh clip here from white to black. And that is because we need to adjust our Eevee material blend mode from opaque to alpha hashed. The reason we're using alpha hashed and not alpha blend is because I found that there can be some difficulties when introducing depth of field and motion blur. This causes issues that alpha hashed doesn't have. Okay, let's jump back into our camera view here, and I'm just going to switch off our overlays. And in our material view, I'm going to introduce a gamma node. This is basically just like a fall-off curve in this context. So let's introduce that. I'm just going to increase the gamma ever so slightly and tweak the color ramp. With that done, let's switch over to our world shader options here and just match the background texture to a similar white to our ground plane. Just going to increase that until it sort of blends nicely. Okay, that looks good. Now we have an infinite fall-off. Okay, that didn't take too long, but it's still looking, well, a little bit better. So in the next video, we'll look at creating some robotic plants and rocks.